He was a man who hadn't spoken in 3 days until he heard the cry. In the middle of the desert, tied to a dying tree, a woman barely clung to life. At her feet, 2 newborns left to die. What happened next wasn't just survival. It was redemption, love, and a second chance no one saw coming. Stay until the end, because the fire he lit that night never went out. You wouldn't find Monument Valley on accident. That land didn't allow for it. The trails were too stubborn, the wind too proud, and the silence it could swallow a man's name and never give it back. The red earth stretched in every direction, painted in old blood and long-forgotten battles. The cliffs rose like monuments to something sacred and cruel, and beneath them a man rode alone. Elias Carver hadn't spoken in 3 days, not since leaving the last town whose name he'd already let go of. His voice had rusted with time, same as the hinges on the rifle across his back, or the saddle leather creaking beneath him. His horse, a dapple-gray mare named Cricket, moved with a steadiness that matched his own. No rush, no panic, just the patience of something that had learned life came for you either way. Elias didn't mind the silence. He'd gotten used to it after burying too many things. His parents, his past, and something else he didn't talk about, not even in his own head. He rode the wide country not to get anywhere, but to stay gone. A man like him had long since stopped believing in arrivals. Then the wind changed. It wasn't much, just a whisper at first. A sound barely lifted by the air, soft, brittle, almost like the desert itself was sighing. But he heard it, and Elias knew enough of pain to recognize it when it tried to hide. He pulled Cricket to a stop, turned his head. Nothing but sun and shadow and dust. Then he heard it again, a cry so faint it might have belonged to a ghost. Not a coyote, not wind through stone, human and small. He dismounted in one slow motion, his boots crunching over cracked earth and scattered sagebrush. He didn't call out, didn't draw his rifle. Just walked, guided by a sound that didn't belong in a place like this. Past 2 leaning fence posts that led nowhere. Past a stand of dry junipers, twisted like old bones. And there, under a dying cottonwood, he saw her. She was tied upright to the trunk wrists, raw dress torn at the sleeve. Her head slumped forward, her hair dark and tangled, matted with blood and dust. And at her feet, 2 bundles wrapped tight in a saddle blanket. They barely moved, but they breathed. He could hear it. Elias went still, like something ancient had stopped him. He looked from the babies to the woman, unsure which needed him more. Then her lips parted. Her voice was dry, cracked nothing more than a scrape of breath. "Don't let them find us." That was all. Her eyes didn't even open. Elias pulled his knife without a word, cut the ropes with careful hands. When her body gave out, he caught her, cradled her like something that had been dropped too many times. She was light. Not just thin, but emptied. He checked the babies next. 2 girls. Days old, maybe less. One whimpered weakly. The other stared up at him, blinking, slow, her mouth working at the air. He wrapped them tighter, tucked them against his chest beneath his coat. Then he lifted the woman into his arms and walked back to the mare. Cricket didn't protest. She lowered her head as he balanced the weight across the saddle. The woman on one side, the twins on the other. And then they moved again through the fading day and into dusk. He brought them to an old shack nestled between 2 hills hidden from the trail. He'd found it months ago and claimed it without ceremony. The roof was patched with tin, the door hung crooked, but it held warmth and a place to rest, and for now that made it holy. Inside, Elias built a fire, boiled water, and laid the woman still unconscious on the cot. He checked her arms, rope burns, bruises, dried blood near her temple. He didn't look too long. Some pain didn't need inspection. He covered her with a wool blanket and turned to the babies. They were cold, hungry. He opened a tin of goat's milk he'd been saving, warmed it, gently dipped clean cloths in it, fed them as best he could, slowly letting the drops reach their tongues. One of them sucked greedily, the other took longer. Elias didn't speak, not even to himself. He only watched them, the way their fingers curled, the soft way their breath came. These 2 lives should have ended in the dust, but they hadn't. By the time the fire settled into embers, the wind had picked up again. Not wild, just moving. It pressed against the shack like a question. Elias sat on the floor near the cot, his back to the wall, the babies asleep in a crate lined with old clothes, the woman breathing shallow beneath the quilt. He didn't know her name, didn't know who had done this or why, but he knew one thing as clear as the stars beyond the crooked window: he wasn't leaving them. Not tonight, not tomorrow. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Elias Carver felt something stir inside the emptiness. Not quite hope, not yet, but maybe the shadow of it. And outside, the desert listened, quiet, watchful, waiting. The first light of morning spilled through the broken slats of the shack like a blessing that hadn't decided if it meant to stay. Elias was already moving slow but steady, his boots making little sound on the wooden floor. He stirred the fire with a stick of split pine, watching the flames catch again, gentle and low. The woman, Clara, still hadn't stirred, but she was breathing, and for now that was enough. He poured water from a dented kettle into a tin cup, tested it against his wrist, then dipped a clean cloth and moved to her side. Her skin flinched slightly at the touch, but her eyes stayed closed. The bruises on her temple had darkened. Her wrists looked like they'd been bound for days. Elias didn't speak. Words felt like strangers in his mouth after all this time. He just worked steady and careful, like everything might break if he didn't. The babies, he'd started calling them Willow and June, though no one had told him their names, slept in a crate by the fire, wrapped in spare flannel shirts. When they fussed, he fed them the last of the goat's milk he'd warmed again with a little water. It wasn't much, but they drank it like they trusted him. That trust did something strange to his chest. Outside, the wind had calmed, but it still spoke in low hums through the trees like it was keeping watch. Inside, the silence stretched, but it wasn't empty anymore. It held breathing. Fire. The fragile sound of tiny bodies settling into sleep. And Elias, a man who hadn't called anything his in years, moved among it all with a strange sense of purpose. On the 3rd morning, she opened her eyes. They were hazel, though dulled by pain and confusion. She blinked up at the ceiling, then slowly turned her head. Her voice, when it came, was nothing more than air and grit. "Where am I?" Elias crouched beside her. "Safe." She flinched. Her eyes searched him, not quite trusting. "Who are you, Elias Carver?" She looked around, taking in the fire, the babies, the old walls. Are they alive?" he said. "Hungry, but alive." Something in her cracked just then, not loud, not seen, but Elias felt it like wind shifting across dry grass. She turned her head away and said nothing more. He brought her water, held the cup to her lips. She drank in sips, slow and desperate. That day passed in pieces. Clara dozed between waking and sleep. The babies cried more often. Elias changed them, awkward but gentle. Fed them again, careful with every drop. He mended a hole in the saddlebag, checked the roof for leaks, patched a draft near the door. He moved around the space like someone who knew better than to let time go idle. Clara watched him from the cot. She never asked questions, never offered thanks, but her eyes softened each time he lifted one of the girls, each time he hummed low under his breath without meaning to. On the 5th day, she sat up on her own. The blanket slid off her shoulders and she pulled it back up quickly. Modesty and pride even now. Elias didn't look, just set a bowl of stew beside her on the stool. "You're healing," he said. She nodded, took the spoon with unsteady fingers. "What day is it?" "Doesn't much matter out here. Where is here? 10 miles west of the valley edge, off trail, quiet." She chewed in silence, then asked, "Why did you help me?" Elias looked at the fire. "Because you needed it. No one else did. I'm not everyone else." The words hung there quiet but firm. She didn't answer, didn't need to. That evening, as he fed the twins, Clara walked across the room, barefoot, wrapped in a second blanket he'd left folded for her. She knelt beside the crate and reached out. One of the girls gripped her thumb strong for someone so small. Clara didn't cry, but her chin trembled. "She looks like him," she whispered. Elias didn't ask who him was. Some names had too much weight behind them. Instead, he said, "She's here. That's what counts." She nodded, though she didn't look at him. "Willow," she said, softly, pointing. "And that one's June." He smiled, just a little, just enough to shift something in his weathered face. Good names. That night he carved. Sitting near the fire, he took a scrap of pine and whittled it into the shape of a horse. It was rough imperfect, but it stood on its own. The next morning, he left it on the crate beside the twins. Clara found it when she woke. She turned it in her fingers, ran her thumb along the carved mane. Then she looked over at him. "Did you?" He just nodded, went back to stirring the stew. Her voice, when it came again, was gentler. "Thank you." The days that followed settled into a rhythm. Elias fetched water, cooked what little they had mended the cot frame, and kept the fire going. Clara began to help folding rags, tending the girls humming a melody too old to have a name. She moved slowly but with purpose, like a woman trying to stitch herself back together. One morning, a visitor came. Martha Hensley, town widow and self-appointed guardian of propriety. She rode up on a mule with a bag of flour and eyes sharp as fence wire. "Well," she said, dismounting and squinting at the shack, "looks like you've taken in more than a stray dog this time, Elias." Clara stood frozen on the porch, the baby's blankets hanging from a line nearby. Martha sniffed. "People are talking." Elias stepped outside, arms folded. "They always do." "She's not your wife. She's not your business." Martha dropped the flour by the post. "Suit yourself." But folks remember things, especially the kind of things left half dead in the desert. She climbed back on the mule, gave Clara one last look, then left. That evening, Clara didn't speak. She sat by the fire, shoulders tight. Elias fixed the door hinge in silence. Finally, she said, "They'll never stop seeing me as a mistake." Elias didn't look up. "They're not the ones keeping this fire burning." She turned to him slowly. "Why are you so quiet?" He set down the hinge. "Because sometimes words just get in the way of listening." The fire popped softly. The twins slept between them, tiny chests rising and falling in peace. Clara reached for another log, placed it on the fire herself. For the first time, Elias let her. And the room, though small, felt just a little more like home. It was the quiet that warned her. The kind of quiet that doesn't settle in but crouches, waits. Clara had learned the difference. There was the peace she'd come to know inside the little shack, the steady creak of Elias's boots on the porch, the pop of the fire, the breathy murmurs of Willow and June as they slept beside one another in their pinewood cradle. That was quiet she could trust. But this morning's silence was something else. She felt it before she saw anything. A weight in the air, like the land itself had started holding its breath. The birds had stopped calling. Even the wind, which usually played along the eaves like a wandering flute, had gone still. She stepped to the window with a wet cloth in her hand, wiping slowly, her heartbeat suddenly louder than anything else. Then she saw them. 3 riders, barely more than silhouettes through the rising heat waves, but she knew the man in the center, knew the way he sat, his saddle back stiff as judgment jaw set like a stone wall. Ray, her late husband's brother, the man who'd once told her to die quietly if she couldn't bear sons. The other 2 men flanking him were hired hands, rough around the edges, rifles slung easy at their sides, hired for fear, not finesse. She dropped the cloth. Elias had already stepped out onto the porch. He didn't say a word, didn't take his rifle, though it leaned within reach beside the door. He simply stood there, hands loose at his sides, body still but alert, like the land had passed its silence into him. The horses stopped a dozen paces out. Ray was the first to speak, his voice like gravel in old boots. "That woman inside belongs to my family." Elias didn't move. His reply came soft, but it carried. "She's not a thing to own." Ray spat into the dust. "She was married to my brother, and them babies carry our blood." Elias's eyes narrowed just slightly, as if measuring how much of that sentence was truth and how much was poison. "Then your brother should have stayed alive to raise them." Ray's lips curled, not in amusement but fury, masked behind pride. One of his men shifted in his saddle. The other reached and cocked his rifle, slow and loud like punctuation. Clara stood just inside the doorway. She could see Elias clearly, the set of his shoulders, the stillness of his hands. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't reached for steel. But there was a kind of power in him she hadn't seen before. The kind that didn't need to threaten because it had already decided what it would do if pressed. "I don't want to see this turn ugly," Ray said, but there was a tremor in it. The kind that comes from realizing you might have underestimated the man in front of you. Elias stepped down off the porch, slow and deliberate. "Then ride back down this hill," he said, "or I bury 3 more names before supper." The wind, as if waiting for its cue, rose slightly, sweeping through the junipers like a whisper from the past. Ray looked toward the window and saw Clara watching him. Their eyes locked, and she saw it contempt, sure, but also something weaker beneath it. Guilt, maybe, or fear dressed up as righteousness. "She ain't worth it," Rancher Ray barked. "Women like her, they ruin good men." Elias didn't blink, didn't flinch. "She's still more woman than you'll ever be, man." That did it. Ray yanked his reins and turned. The 2 riders followed, but not before one of them looked back once, uneasy. Then they were gone, swallowed by trees and distance, leaving only the stir of dust behind. Elias stood in the silence for a long moment before turning and stepping inside. He found Clara standing by the hearth, hands clenched in her apron shoulders, taut. "I didn't ask you to fight for me," she said quietly, not meeting his gaze. "I didn't do it for you." She looked up, then startled. "I did it because no one should have to beg to be left alone." Her breath caught. She nodded once but said nothing more. That night neither of them slept. The babies were restless. The wind returned, brushing against the roof like an old friend seeking news. Elias sat near the door, sharpening his blade. Clara sat by the fire, her fingers twisting the hem of her dress. Finally, she said, "I don't belong anywhere. You belong here," he answered without hesitation. She looked down at her lap. "I've never belonged anywhere, not with my husband, not in his family's house. I was something to marry, something to carry children. That's all." Elias poured warm water into her cup, then crouched beside her. "You're not something," he said softly. "You're someone." She took the cup, her hands trembling as she held it close. "I'm tired of running," she whispered. Then stop. She looked at him, and in his face she didn't find pity. She found certainty, the kind that doesn't need explaining. "I don't know how." He didn't touch her. just sat near steady as a stone. "You stay, that's how." The fire cracked between them. It was small but steady, and Clara realized perhaps for the first time that she didn't feel like a shadow waiting to be erased. She felt real, present, like she'd finally come into focus. She reached out and their hands touched not in clutching or urgency but in quiet understanding. Her fingers rested on his and it was enough. Enough to say I see you. Enough to mean I'm here too. Outside, the wind turned warm again, not wild, not angry, just moving forward like something old had finally let go. And in that little cabin on a land that had taken more than it gave a woman, began to believe she could stop running, and a man began to believe he was meant to stay. It came with the morning sun, a letter folded neatly, hand-delivered by a red-faced courier who didn't linger long enough to explain who had sent him. Clara held it in her hands for a long while before she opened it, her thumb brushing the edge like the paper might cut more than skin. Elias had just returned from a short ride into the hills, bringing back a basket of herbs and a strip of fresh jerky. He saw the change in her face before she even said a word. Something inside her had pulled tight again like a thread on the verge of snapping. "It's from Charleston," she said, not looking up. He didn't ask what it said, not right away. He just nodded and went to wash his hands. The babies were cooing in their cradle, unaware that something in the air had shifted. After supper, she placed the letter on the table between them, unfolded. He read it without touching it. A cousin, distant but not unkind, had heard about her ordeal. News travels even when no one carries it. There was talk of a house, a small inheritance from a grandfather she barely remembered, a nursemaid for the girls, a room of her own. A new start, a clean one. She waited while Elias finished reading. He didn't make a face, didn't let the news ripple across his features. "Well," he said at last, "that's something." Clara folded the letter again with slow hands. "It's more than I ever expected." He nodded. "You going?" She didn't answer. They didn't speak of it again that night, but she packed a bag the next morning anyway, just in case. She folded the clothes she had mended, tucked in the wooden horse Elias had carved for the girls, wrapped it in a piece of cloth that smelled like the cabin. When she zipped the leather ties shut, her fingers trembled. Elias didn't stop her. He didn't try to talk her out of it. He brought in kindling added wood to the fire and laid a parcel beside her satchel: bread, cheese, a spare wool blanket, a small flask of water. When she saw it, something inside her crumbled a little. "You're really going to let me leave?" she asked softly. He looked up from where he was sharpening a blade. "Was never my place to keep you. But you could ask me to stay." He set the blade down gently. His eyes met hers. "I want you to stay," he said. "But only if it's what you want." Her throat closed around the words. She sat down hard on the chair, the packed bag beside her like a witness. The girls were napping nearby, curled into one another like they hadn't been born into anything hard. "Do you think I'd be a fool to leave?" she whispered. "No," Elias said. "Only a fool stays where they're not free." She looked at him long and hard then. Really looked. At the man who had never asked anything of her, who had defended her without demand, who had rebuilt the fence when it didn't need mending just because he thought it might make her feel safer, who left space for her always, who never asked for thanks yet offered comfort like breathing. She thought of the house in Charleston, the nursemaid, the soft sheets and warm water. A life that sounded simple, but she couldn't picture it. Not clearly. Not the way she could picture Elias crouched beside the stove stirring oats, his hair damp from snow, his sleeves rolled to the elbows. Not the way she could picture the way he looked at her, not like she was broken, but like she had just begun. She didn't speak as he saddled her mare. didn't speak as he loaded the bag and secured the bundle of food. The babies had been fed and bundled, the cabin swept. Everything in its place. He helped her into the saddle, one steady hand beneath her elbow, and still she said nothing. She rode to the edge of the ridge alone, stopping just where the land dipped and the road curved east. The view stretched wide before her barren hills, red earth, the suggestion of distance. Freedom, some might say, but it didn't feel like that. She looked back. Elias stood at the porch, still as stone. He didn't wave, didn't call after her. He just watched. She turned the horse slowly. The air was crisp, the kind that made your breath hitch a little before it warmed you. She held the reins, stared at the open trail, then back at the cabin. The fire smoke curled lazily from the chimney. The sound of a baby's soft cry carried across the stillness. She rode back without a word. Elias was already reaching to help her down before she said anything. "I can't go," she whispered. "I don't want a place that just makes me disappear quietly. I want somewhere I'm allowed to take up space, somewhere I can build." He nodded. "Then stay." She dropped the satchel. It hit the ground with a soft thump, final and full. Her hands found his. Not in desperation, but in decision. "I don't know what I'm doing," she said, half a laugh, half a sob. "You don't have to," he replied. That night she undid the bag and unpacked each item, slowly folding and placing them back into the shelves, as if claiming the space one drawer at a time. She wrapped the wooden horse in her shawl and laid it beside the cradle. Elias cooked as he always did. Nothing changed, and yet everything did. Later, as the babies slept and the moon sat low above the horizon, Clara stood by the window and whispered, "I almost didn't choose this. Almost let fear win." Elias stepped beside her. "But you didn't." She nodded. And for the first time she felt the ground beneath her not as something to flee, but something she might one day call home. They didn't plan a wedding. It simply happened the way winter gives way to spring, without asking, without permission, only with time and trust. A preacher from the next town over rode out on a mule with a Bible wrapped in cloth and a flask in his vest pocket. He was nearly deaf, couldn't hear half of what Clara said when she repeated her vows, but he smiled like he'd heard it all anyway. They stood beneath a cottonwood tree, its new green leaves barely uncurling, as if stretching after a long sleep. Elias wore his best shirt, which still had one missing button, but had been ironed as smooth as it would go. Clara wore a dress she had sewn herself from the only blue curtain in the cabin, cinched at the waist with ribbon. It didn't fit perfectly, but it felt like hers, and that was enough. Willow and June sat in a wooden crate nearby, decorated with wildflowers and pine sprigs. Martha Hensley came too, half in protest, half in curiosity. She brought pickled beets no one asked for and a look that said, "I knew this would happen, even though she hadn't." Clara thanked her anyway. When it came time to speak, Elias said only 3 words. "I choose you." Not loud, not rehearsed, just steady and true. That was all, and somehow it felt like more than enough. Clara whispered her part in return, her voice catching on the wind. After the preacher left, after the sun dipped behind the hills, and the guests had gone back to wherever they belonged, Elias and Clara sat on the porch in silence. Not because there was nothing to say, but because there was nothing that needed saying. The twins slept between them, their small breaths filling the quiet. Time moved slowly after that, but it moved well. The land began to soften, the snow melting away from the pine roots, the grass poking up through the thaw. Elias built a garden box from old fence rails, filled it with soil brought from the creek bed. Clara planted seeds, carrots, beans, herbs for healing. She hummed while she worked a sound that once would have surprised her. Some mornings, Elias would bring her thread from town yellow-green, whatever the store had left. She stitched curtains, baby clothes a patch for Elias's worn-out sleeve. On Sundays, he read from the old Bible his mother had given him, voice low, fingers running under the words like they still carried weight. The girls grew fast. Willow was bold, reaching for everything. June was quiet, always watching. Elias called them his little thistles, tough things with soft hearts. He carved them wooden toys, a rabbit, a bear, a horse with a crooked tail. Clara watched him whittle each piece like he was writing a story into the wood grain. And though the days were filled with chores and cries and meals made from scratch, Clara found herself smiling more often than not. The kind of smile that comes slow but stays long. The kind you don't fake. Still, the world outside hadn't forgotten her. Letters arrived now and then, some from cousins, some from strangers who claimed distant relation. One even came from a newspaper man who'd heard of her ordeal and wanted her story. She never answered. Some stories belonged to silence. One afternoon, as she rocked Willow to sleep, Clara found a small book tucked behind the mantel, a worn volume of Psalms. Inside the cover, faded handwriting, "To Elias from your mother, for when silence gets heavy." She opened it gently, the pages soft from use, edges smudged with time. Many verses had lines under them. Others had notes in the margins, scribbled in a neat, careful hand. She turned one page, then another, and found herself reading aloud without meaning to. Elias walked in quietly, heard her voice, and paused by the door. "I didn't know you read scripture," she said, closing the book softly. "Only the verses that feel like songs," he replied. That night, as the girls tossed restlessly, Elias took June in his arms and paced the cabin. Clara watched him move with the grace of someone who didn't know they were graceful. He whispered something, words she couldn't catch, and the baby's eyelids fluttered shut like they were listening to the sound of peace itself. Clara stood beside him when he laid her back down. Their eyes met, and for a long moment they didn't look away. It wasn't romance in the storybook sense. It wasn't grand. It was quieter, deeper. The kind of love that grows in the soft corners of hard seasons. Spring came in full. Clara stood barefoot on the porch one morning, Willow on her hip, June toddling at her feet. The sky above Monument Valley glowed with the kind of blue that only shows up after sorrow has passed. She breathed deep, felt the sun on her neck, and realized she had stopped waiting for something to go wrong. Behind her, Elias was fixing the latch on the cabin door, muttering to himself. The smell of bread drifted from the stove. A bird called from the trees, and another answered. She turned and looked at him, this man who had asked for nothing, who had offered everything in return. He caught her watching, and instead of asking why, he just smiled. Later that evening, as twilight settled and the girls slept, Clara stood by the window and watched Elias finish his work on the new gate. He had carved something into the top post, and though she couldn't see it from the house, she knew what it was. Their initials, not just hers and his, but the girls, too. 4 letters side by side. A family carved into wood that would outlast storms. She stepped outside and joined him. "You didn't have to do that," she said, resting her hand on the post. "I wanted to," he replied. "Why?" He looked at her the way he always had, not like she was someone saved, but someone chosen. "Because some places you find," he said, "and some places find you." Clara leaned into him, and for the first time since her life had turned upside down, she realized she wasn't surviving anymore. She was living. In the heart of the desert, under the shadow of Monument Valley's ancient stone towers, a man named Elias Carver chose to live not loudly, but with meaning. His story began not with triumph, but with stillness. A man of few words and many scars, Elias had wandered for years, his silence a refuge, his loneliness an old friend. He wasn't searching for anything, not really. Sometimes life finds you when you've stopped looking. It began with a cry. fragile, broken, carried on the wind. And from that moment his path, so long marked by quiet survival, intersected with the battered life of a woman named Clara and her 2 newborn daughters. She had been left for dead, tied up, discarded, forgotten. Yet something in Elias refused to turn away. He brought her home, gave her warmth, rest, safety, not with promises but through actions. And in that small cabin stitched together from timber smoke and silence, something new took root. Not love, not right away, but trust. And trust, when given time, grows roots deeper than anything else. Clara was broken in ways that didn't show in bruises alone. Her voice trembled when it returned. Her eyes were slow to meet another's gaze. But she learned that Elias wasn't a man who demanded answers. He listened without asking, waited without pressure, and because of that she began to mend not as someone trying to be who she was before, but as someone becoming who she was always meant to be. The twins, Willow and June, grew under this roof of quiet care. They laughed, cried, kicked, and cooed. Elias, who'd never raised a child, adapted without complaint. He carved toys for them out of scrap wood, fed them warm milk, held them like something precious because to him they were. But the world doesn't forget so easily. Clara's past came knocking in the form of 3 riders who came with claims of blood legacy and ownership. They spoke as if Clara and her daughters were property. But Elias stood his ground. He didn't reach for his rifle. He didn't threaten with volume. He stood with resolve that no storm could shake. He told them she wasn't theirs. She wasn't a thing, and when they rode away, it wasn't with victory. It was with the realization that she was no longer alone. Clara's heart was tested once more when a letter arrived from Charleston. An offer of escape, comfort, legitimacy, a home of her own with servants and inheritance, everything she had been told she didn't deserve. She packed her bag, said her goodbyes. Elias didn't try to stop her. He simply said, "I want you to stay, but only if it's what you want." And at the edge of that ridge, as the world opened wide in front of her, Clara realized something she hadn't known before. She didn't want a life that erased her pain. She wanted a life that had made peace with it. She turned around, rode back home, chose him, chose this place, chose herself. They married without fanfare. Just 2 souls saying yes to a future they would build one day at a time. Elias said, "I choose you." That was his vow, simple, steady, and true. From then on, their days were not extraordinary, but they were full. Of bread, baking, wood chopping, laughter, lullabies. Of planting, building, carving, and quiet prayers spoken over sleeping children. And in all that time, Clara stopped flinching when someone touched her shoulder. She stopped folding into herself. She began to write her own name with pride, not because she was someone's wife or someone's mother, but because she was her own. Elias built her a cradle with their initials carved into it. Later, he built a fence, then a garden, then a new door with carvings along the top symbols of the family they had become. And every night he fed the fire. Not because it was his job, but because it was how he said, "You matter. You are safe." This story isn't about miracles, it's about choices. A man who chose to stay, a woman who chose to live. 2 children who will grow up knowing the sound of safety, and a love that came not in a rush, but like spring thawing the last of winter's hold. So, what's the lesson? It's this: you don't have to be perfect to be worthy of love. You don't have to be loud to be strong. And you don't need to be rescued to begin again. Sometimes the greatest courage isn't fighting a battle. It's sitting beside someone in their silence and letting them know you're not leaving. Elias didn't try to fix Clara. He didn't offer speeches or promises. He offered a place to rest, a fire that never went out, and that more than grand gestures or loud declarations is what makes a home. And for anyone listening today, maybe your home isn't a cabin in the valley. Maybe it's a room full of quiet moments. Maybe it's a person who listens, or maybe it's still waiting to be built. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that strength can be soft and healing can take time, I invite you to subscribe to this channel, because here we tell stories that matter, stories that heal, stories that make us feel less alone in the quiet. Hit that subscribe button and help us keep this fire burning, because somewhere out there someone else is listening for a cry in the wind, and maybe, just maybe, you'll be the one who answers.